The ranger who wasn't. I was 29 when I took the contract with the U.S. Forest Service. At the time, it was just another seasonal survey, 6 weeks mapping wildlife movement and maintaining trail cameras in the Cascade Range. I'd been doing this kind of work since my early 20s. Long stretches alone didn't bother me. Isolation was part of the job, and the procedures were familiar enough that most days blurred together. Wake before dawn, log weather conditions, hike fixed routes, check cameras, record tracks and scat, radio in at scheduled intervals, sleep, repeat. The assignment area sat off Forest Road 23, beyond a gate that hadn't been locked in years. Old-growth timber, no recent logging, limited recreational traffic. The kind of place supervisors like to describe as undisturbed. I established base camp near a disused trailhead, flat ground, access to water, clear lines for radio transmission. Everything checked out on paper. The first week passed without incident. No equipment failures, no missed check-ins. I documented elk movement, signs of black bear, occasional cougar tracks. Routine. But there was an absence I couldn't log on any form. The forest was quiet, not peaceful, just empty. No bird song at dawn, no night insects. Even wind through the canopy felt muted, like it was being absorbed before it reached the ground. I told myself it was seasonal variance, late summer shifts patterns. That explanation worked until the 8th night. I was sitting by the fire, reviewing notes, when I heard boots on gravel. Not cautious steps, deliberate, heavy. Someone approaching without concern for being heard. I stood and turned toward the tree line. A man emerged wearing a Forest Service ranger uniform, tan shirt, green pants, campaign hat. He carried a flashlight but kept it off. The light from my fire showed his face clearly enough. Middle-aged, clean-shaven, expression neutral to the point of blankness. He greeted me like a checklist item, asked for permits. I handed over my documentation, laminated ID, assignment letter, radio call sign. He examined them longer than procedure required. No small talk, no questions. When he spoke again, he said I was in a restricted zone and needed to vacate by morning. I asked which designation. Temporary closure? Wildlife management? He didn't answer, just looked at me. I remember noticing he didn't blink. Not once. After a pause that felt measured, he said there had been incidents, people going missing. Area scheduled to close soon. Then he turned and walked back into the trees. No radio call, no flashlight, no vehicle noise. The forest swallowed him without disturbance. At first light, I contacted the district office. They confirmed there were no closures, no missing persons cases tied to that sector, and no ranger assigned patrol duties anywhere near my coordinates. When I described the uniform, the dispatcher hesitated, put me on hold, came back and said the design I described hadn't been issued since the early 1980s. That was enough for me to break protocol. I decided to pack out. Before dismantling camp, I pulled the SD cards from my trail cameras. One unit had been positioned near my tent for wildlife proximity data. Reviewing the footage on my laptop, I saw the timestamp, 2:47 a.m. The same man stood at the edge of my camp. He wasn't moving, not shifting weight, not scanning, just facing my tent. The camera clock ran for 11 minutes. No environmental movement registered, no branches, no insects, no wind. At 2:58, he turned and walked backward into the forest. Smoothly, step by step, never breaking eye line with the tent. The camera lost him to darkness without triggering another motion event. I reported everything. The footage, the encounter. 2 Forest Service officials arrived the next afternoon. They inspected the area, found no footprints, no compression in the soil. Nothing indicating human presence. But near where the figure had stood, one of them uncovered a ranger name tag beneath moss and duff. William Hackett. Badge number from this district. Records showed Hackett disappeared in 1983 during a solo patrol. Weather clear, no distress call, no body recovered. The official report listed my experience as a misidentification under low-light stress. The footage was classified as inconclusive. The name tag was logged as a historical artifact, likely lost decades earlier. 2 months later, I received a voicemail from an unlisted number. Static. Then a voice, flat and procedural. "You're in a restricted zone? I don't camp alone anymore, and Forest Road 23 is still open." The buried cache. I've been a land surveyor for most of my adult life. It's quiet work, technical, measured. I spend weeks alone in forests, deserts, scrubland, places most people never have a reason to enter. My days usually follow the same pattern: sunrise setup, equipment calibration, grid walks, documentation, repeat. I rarely interact with locals beyond a diner or a supply stop. That distance suits me. The job rewards patience and attention, not curiosity. In the spring of 2019, I was contracted to map a 400-acre parcel in northern Maine, just south of the Allagash Wilderness boundary. The client was a regional timber company preparing for a controlled harvest. They needed updated boundary assessments and confirmation of legacy survey markers before filing with the state. It was routine federal adjacent work, 10 days on site. Solo assignment. I arrived in the area on a Sunday afternoon. The nearest town was barely a town. One general store, a volunteer fire station, and a post office open 3 days a week. No cell service beyond the main road. The parcel itself sat several miles down an unmaintained logging track, bordered on 2 sides by protected wilderness. Once I parked and hiked in with my gear, there was nothing around me but trees, wet ground, and distance. The first 3 days passed without incident. I established my baseline points, verified corner markers, and began sweeping for older subsurface pins using a metal detector, standard practice in parcels with disputed historical boundaries. On the 4th day, mid-morning, I got a signal that didn't match anything I'd encountered before. Strong, dense, deep, about 3 feet below the surface. I assumed it was rebar or a capped pipe, maybe debris from old logging operations. I marked the coordinates and started digging. What I uncovered wasn't metal at all. It was a hard plastic container, rectangular, olive-colored, sealed with a rubber gasket. Military-grade storage, waterproof. No external markings. That was the moment the job stopped being routine. I opened the container on site. Inside were dozens of photographs, Polaroids mostly, stacked carefully, separated by wax paper. The images showed campsites, ordinary ones, tents, coolers, folding chairs, fire rings, families posing, couples smiling, solo hikers sitting on logs. Nothing alarming at first glance. Then I noticed the background. Every photograph contained the same figure, positioned just beyond the main focus of the image. Sometimes behind a tree. Sometimes near the tree line. Always distant. Always partially obscured. Dark jacket. Neutral stance. Face never visible. The person didn't belong to the group being photographed, and no one in the images appeared aware of them. Beneath the photographs was a handwritten notebook, spiral-bound, waterproof paper. The entries were dated and precise. Coordinates, arrival and departure times, behavioral notes. It read less like a diary and more like a field log. Family of 4, arrived 6/12/98, Left 6:14:98. Noticed watcher 6:13, 9:47 p.m. Did not engage. Another entry ended differently. Solo male. Arrived 7:01:98. Tent located 7:03. No departure recorded. There were 17 entries total spanning from 1996 to 1999. 9 of them ended with the same phrase. No departure recorded. I documented everything, resealed the container, and contacted my supervisor, who escalated it immediately. By the next morning, Maine State Police were on site. Within 48 hours, the FBI joined them. The area was cordoned off. My work was suspended indefinitely. Federal excavation began less than 10 meters from where I'd found the container. At 6 feet down, they uncovered human remains, partial skeletal fragments, wrapped in industrial tarps. Preliminary forensics identified 3 individuals. No personal effects, no identification. As the investigation expanded, analysts cross-referenced the photographs with missing persons databases. One match came back within a week. A woman named Laura Kinney reported missing in 1999 after failing to check in along a known hiking route. She was visible in one of the Polaroids, smiling, standing near a tent, unaware. The figure in the background remained unidentified. The timber company withdrew from the project without explanation. The land was seized under federal authority. I was interviewed 4 times over the next month, by state police, by federal agents, by a joint task force. They asked me detailed questions about my movements, my routines, whether I'd noticed anyone watching me during my time on site. I told them the truth. I hadn't noticed anything. Not once. That answer didn't seem to satisfy them. At their request, I submitted all of my own survey photographs, hundreds of images taken for documentation purposes, elevation shots, marker verifications, tree lines. When analysts processed them, they found something I hadn't. In 3 of my photographs taken on separate days, the same figure appeared, distant, almost indistinguishable from the forest. Same posture, same dark jacket. I had no memory of seeing anyone when I took those photos. I had been alone, completely. After the discovery of the remains, local officials stopped cooperating. Records requests stalled. Access permits were delayed or denied. The investigation continued, but quietly. Over the next 2 years, 2 additional burial sites were located within a mile of my original work area. 12 victims total. No arrests, no suspects. The case remains open. I no longer accept work in Maine. I changed my routes, my routines. I stopped taking solo contracts in remote areas whenever possible. Last year, a package arrived at my home. No return address. Inside was a single Polaroid photograph. It showed me standing in that forest, holding my surveying equipment. The timestamp was clear. The photo was dated 3 days after I left the site. In the background, just barely inside the frame, someone was watching. The Lakeshore Recordings. I was working steadily in 2021, nothing unusual. Field recording had become routine for me. Long stretches alone, early mornings, careful notes, clean data. My days were predictable. I tested equipment, logged frequencies, shipped hard drives, invoiced clients. Most of my work ended up buried in the background of documentaries or meditation apps, places where no one questioned where the sound came from as long as it felt real. I liked that. Sound doesn't ask questions. It just records what's there. That summer, I was contracted to collect pristine wilderness audio in the Boundary Waters Canoe Area Wilderness. The brief was specific: no engines, no voices, no aircraft, no distant mechanical noise. The client wanted long, uninterrupted overnight recordings, dusk to dawn, capturing water movement, wind through pine, insect cycles, loon calls. They wanted isolation documented, not just implied. I accepted because I'd worked in northern Minnesota before. I knew the protocols, permits, equipment declarations, ranger check-ins. Nothing about it felt risky. 5 nights on Knife Lake, solo, base camp on an unmarked island. That was the plan. The trigger that changed everything came late on the 3rd night, but nothing about the day itself stood out. I paddled out early, set camp, ran test tones, anchored my hydrophones, elevated my omnidirectional mics. I logged GPS coordinates and weather conditions, barometric pressure steady, wind minimal. By dusk, everything was running on continuous record. Knife Lake is large, but where I was camping it felt sealed off. No trails, no visible campsites on neighboring islands. Sound carries there, but only if there's something to carry. The first 2 nights were textbook. Clean wave patterns, distant wildlife, no anomalies. At 11:34 p.m. on the 3rd night, my primary recorder captured a human voice. I didn't hear it live. I was inside my tent cataloging files from the previous night, headphones on but not monitoring the live feed. The waveform spike appeared later when I reviewed the timestamp. The voice was faint, male, steady, low amplitude but clear enough to isolate. She needs to stay still. If she moves, it starts over. No accent I could place, no panic, no urgency. It wasn't conversational, it sounded procedural, like instruction being repeated from memory. I assumed at first it was a distant camper. Sound can travel unpredictably across water at night. But there were no other permits listed for nearby islands. When I stepped outside the tent and shut off my headlamp, the lake was silent. No paddles, no voices, no movement. At 11:41 p.m., the recorder picked up a second voice. Female, crying, not loud, no screaming. Just intermittent sobbing, irregular breathing, like someone trying not to make noise. That's when I turned off the live monitor and listened directly to the environment. Nothing. Absolute stillness. Even the insects had dropped out. I turned the recorder back on and let it run. At 12:03 a.m., the male voice returned. Same tone, same distance. Good, that's good. Now we wait. 7 minutes later, there was a sound I still have trouble describing in neutral terms. It registered as a low-frequency drag. Wet, uneven, sustained. Something heavy moving over stone near water. It lasted 12 seconds. I didn't sleep after that. I stayed awake until first light, breaking down equipment as quietly as I could. I logged everything. Time codes, mic orientation, gain levels. I didn't listen again until I reached the ranger station. The ranger on duty listened with me. He didn't comment much. He asked where I'd been camped, whether I'd seen anyone. He said he'd forward the files to the county sheriff. That was the extent of it. No incident report was filed in my name. 3 weeks passed. Then I received a call from an FBI field office in Minneapolis. They asked me to bring my original drives and all field notes. We met in a federal building conference room. 2 agents, 1 recorder on the table. They asked about my background, my equipment, my process. Then they asked about the island. Exact coordinates, sightlines, distances to shore. Whether I'd noticed any structures, old fire rings, disturbed soil. I hadn't, but they already knew that. They told me about Sarah and Emily Novak. In 1998, the sisters vanished while canoeing in the Boundary Waters. Experienced paddlers. Proper gear. Their canoe was found overturned near Knife Lake. No bodies, no definitive cause. The case went cold. In 2003, Leonard Trask was arrested in Michigan for an abduction that didn't end the way his others had. During interrogation, he volunteered information about Minnesota. He said he'd used the islands. He said water erased evidence. He claimed no one heard anything at night. There were notes in the file about Knife Lake, about instruction, about making victims stay still. Trask was convicted on other charges. He was never formally tied to the Novak sisters. He died in prison in 2019. The agents told me this carefully, like they were reading from a prepared summary. Then they played me a filtered section of my own recording. At 12:17 a.m., the male voice said, clearly, "Emily, you need to stay still." I hadn't noticed it before, buried in noise. But once isolated, it was unmistakable. Emily Novak had been missing for 23 years. The FBI asked me not to discuss the recordings publicly. They said it could interfere with an ongoing review. They conducted multiple searches of the island. Ground-penetrating radar, canine units, divers. Nothing was recovered, no remains, no tools, no evidence of recent activity. When I asked how a dead man's voice could appear on a modern recording, they didn't answer directly. They used terms like residual audio, environmental imprint, psychological priming. They suggested I might have subconsciously known the name, that exposure to case files could influence perception. But I had never heard of the Novak sisters before that meeting. Months later, I filed a FOIA request for documents related to the Boundary Waters disappearances. Large portions came back redacted. One memo referenced unverified acoustic anomalies and advised limiting public acknowledgement to avoid resource strain and reputational risk. No agency ever accused me of fabricating the audio. They just stopped returning my calls. I don't camp alone anymore. I still work with sound, but I avoid long overnight field recordings in remote areas. The original files are stored in multiple places now. Backups I don't talk about. The island on Knife Lake is still unmarked, no warning signs, no restricted access. Permits are still issued for nearby sites. Every so often, I receive emails from researchers asking about anomalous recordings in wilderness areas. I don't respond. Not because I don't believe them, but because I know how easily sound can be dismissed when it doesn't fit an explanation. The official position is that nothing was found. No threat, no evidence of ongoing danger, but I know what was recorded. And I know that whatever learned to use that isolation understood one thing very well. Water carries sound farther than anyone wants to admit. The permit violation. I'd been a backcountry ranger with the National Park Service for over a decade by the fall of 2020. Yellowstone first, then Glacier, then the North Cascades. Long stretches alone, seasonal contracts, the same green truck, the same radio protocols, the same expectation that if something went wrong, you handled it quietly and wrote it up cleanly. I liked that kind of work. The isolation made sense to me. The rules were clear. The land didn't lie. In October of that year, I was reassigned to Olympic National Park for late-season coastal patrols. Shusha Beach, Point of the Arches, the inland spur trails most visitors never see once the weather turns. It's rugged country, wet, cold, quiet in a way that feels intentional, like the land is discouraging you from staying too long. My daily routine was simple. Hike in. Check established camps, verify permits, log coordinates, make contact if needed. Most violations were minor. People camp too close to water. Miss a zone boundary, forget to hang a permit tag, you explain it. Issue a citation if necessary. 90% of the time they comply and move on. Late October was slower, fewer hikers. Almost no overnight permits issued because of seasonal stream closures. That's why the tent stood out. I was about a mile south of the Shishi Trailhead when I saw it, set up just inside a restricted buffer zone. too close to a seasonal drainage that had been explicitly closed due to erosion risk. No permit tag visible. Neutral-colored tent, well-kept, no trash, no fire ring. I called out, identified myself, waited, nothing. I approached slowly, standard procedure. Knocked on the tent pole, still nothing. No movement, no sound. When I unzipped the door, I expected to find someone asleep or avoiding a citation. Instead, I found an empty sleeping bag, a packed backpack, and a notebook resting neatly on top. Protocol allows us to document unattended violations. I logged the GPS coordinates, photographed the site, and waited 30 minutes. No one returned. The weather was deteriorating. I decided to finish the documentation and leave a citation notice inside the tent. That's when I opened the notebook. It was a handwritten journal, clean handwriting, consistent. The first entry was dated September 14, 2020. Day 1. Arrived at the trailhead, permit denied due to overcrowding, entered anyway, will stay off-grid. At first, it read like a standard long-term backpacking log. Campsite notes, weather conditions, tide charts, mentions of elk sign and raccoon tracks. He documented everything carefully, almost methodically. Around day 9, the tone shifted. Day 9. Saw a ranger today, hid in the trees until she passed, too close. I checked the date. That was 3 weeks earlier. I pulled my patrol logs when I got back to the truck later. I had been assigned to a different sector that week. No recorded ranger contact in that area. The entries continued. Day 12. Heard voices last night. No one else is supposed to be here. Checked the perimeter. Found nothing. At first, I assumed stress, isolation, weather-induced anxiety. It happens more often than people think. By day 15, the language changed again. The voices are closer now. They know my name. No explanation, no speculation, just that sentence. I stopped reading and radioed it in. Search and rescue protocols are clear when there's evidence of a missing or endangered hiker. Within an hour, we had a response moving. That night, I stayed near the site. I didn't sleep much. The area felt wrong. Not dangerous, just unsettled. The usual coastal background noise seemed muted. No wind through the trees, no surf rhythm. It was the kind of silence you notice because it interrupts routine. Search and rescue found him the next morning, about a quarter-mile inland. He was alive. Hypothermic. Disoriented. Hiding in a shallow cave formed by a fallen cedar. No food, no water, no gear. He didn't speak during extraction. At medical intake, he was diagnosed with dehydration, mild hypothermia, and acute stress response. The psych evaluation noted auditory hallucinations consistent with isolation and sleep deprivation. The report was clean, clinical, final. When he finally spoke to me, it was off the record. He said he'd heard people inside his tent, whispering, laughing. He said they sounded like children. When he checked, the tent was empty, but the sleeping bag was moving like someone had just gotten out of it. I didn't include that in my official statement. When we processed the campsite, we found something he hadn't mentioned. Pressed into the tent floor fabric were handprints, small, child-sized, dozens of them. Imprinted through dirt and condensation, as if pressure had been applied from the inside. We photographed them, bagged samples, logged everything. Forensics returned inconclusive, no DNA, no oils, no identifiable residue. The report used the phrase environmental artifacts without elaboration. That should have been the end of it. Instead, the area was quietly closed for the season 2 weeks early. The tent was destroyed as biohazardous waste. The journal was removed from the standard evidence chain and forwarded to regional administration. I was told to stop asking questions. When I filed a follow-up inquiry, I was called into a remote meeting with a regional supervisor I'd never met. He told me the incident was being classified as a mental health emergency, not a safety concern. He instructed me to amend my language in the patrol report to remove references to unidentified markings. I refused. The next week, my patrol assignments changed, coastal routes reassigned, desk work, permit processing. 3 months later, in January, I went back on my own time. The site was officially closed, but access wasn't enforced. Storm season had stripped most surface evidence away. The tent was gone, the ground disturbed, but the handprints were still there, on rocks, on tree trunks, pressed into mud that should have frozen and thawed repeatedly by then. Still small, still fresh-looking. I photographed them again, sent copies to a contact I had in a federal oversight office that handled interagency misconduct. Weeks later, I received a single reply. "We're aware of similar reports." No further explanation. The backpacker never returned to Olympic. His permit record was flagged permanently. I tried to contact him once. The number was disconnected. The site remains officially seasonally restricted. No signage explains why. Sometimes, during late patrols in other parks, I think about that journal. About the way the entries stopped abruptly. About the handprints that didn't belong to anyone we could identify. There was no formal investigation, no press release, no follow-up training, just silence. The land is still there, the trails are still open, and whatever caused that man to abandon his shelter in the middle of the night didn't need a permit to stay. The Trail Angel. I started the Pacific Crest Trail in April of 2018, like most people do, quietly, without ceremony. There's a border monument at Campo, California, but after that, the trail doesn't care who you are. You walk, you eat, you sleep, you repeat. That was the appeal. I'd taken a leave from my job as a GIS contractor, sold most of what I owned, and told people I'd be gone for 6 months. No cell service, no deadlines, just mileage. By Northern California, around mile 1300, routine had become structure. Wake before sunrise, break camp. Walk until heat forced a stop. Filter water. Log miles in a paper notebook. I rarely spoke to anyone unless necessary. I was a solo hiker by choice, and I stayed that way. The first time I heard the name Maggie was near Burney Falls. A group of hikers were talking about water caches ahead, who'd stalked them whether they were reliable. Someone mentioned Maggie, no last name, just Maggie. The way they said it assumed everyone knew who she was. Trail angels are unofficial volunteers, retirees, locals, sometimes former hikers. They leave water jugs in dry stretches, offer rides into town, sometimes meals. Most are well known in limited areas. Maggie, according to the chatter, was different. She covered huge sections, decades on the trail, always alone, always reliable. 2 days later, near Castella, just west of Interstate 5, I saw her. The pullout was shaded by pine trees, just off the highway, but quiet. A folding table, a blue cooler. Handwritten sign, Hikers Welcome. She was sitting in a camp chair, gray hair pulled back, wearing a sun-faded jacket. Early 70s, maybe. She smiled when she saw me and asked how far I was going. "Canada," I said. She nodded, like she'd heard that answer 1,000 times. She handed me a sandwich, a Gatorade, and a small Ziploc bag of cookies. Homemade, no store label. "Long way to go," she said. "You'll make it." I thanked her. I took a photo, standard trail habit, documenting kindness. Then I shouldered my pack and walked back into the trees. I didn't think about it again. Over the next 2 weeks, Maggie's name came up constantly. At water sources, at campsites, always secondhand. Maggie helped me out last year. Maggie used to be everywhere. When I mentioned I'd met her recently, people reacted strangely. Polite disbelief, silence. A few changed the subject. In Sayed Valley, I resupplied at the small general store. It's a known stop. I asked the clerk if she knew Maggie, the trail angel near Castella. Her expression changed immediately, not confusion, recognition. "When did you meet her?" she asked. "Couple weeks ago." She shook her head. "That's not possible." She walked me to a framed photograph on the wall, a memorial, Maggie Frost, 1941-2003. The face was unmistakable. Same eyes, same smile. She'd been killed in a car accident on Highway 5, returning from a water drop. I laughed at first. Then I pulled out my phone. I showed her the photo I'd taken. The image showed the pullout, the table, the cooler, the chair. But Maggie wasn't there, just an empty chair, and a dark shadow where she should have been standing. I checked the Ziploc bag. The cookies were still inside. Under them was a handwritten note. "Stay safe. The trail takes care of its own. M." Other hikers I spoke to confirmed similar stories. A few claimed to have seen her over the years, same location, same supplies, same photo anomaly. No one had a clear image of her. Everyone had something physical she'd given them. I finished the trail in September. Canada, the monument, the end. 2 years later, in 2020, I was sorting gear and found the bag again. At the bottom was a second note I hadn't seen before. "Don't go back to Ridgecrest. Not in August. Trust me. I'd planned a return trip that August. I canceled it. The dome fire burned through Ridgecrest weeks later. 40,000 acres, 2 dead hikers. I still have the notes. I still don't know who or what Maggie was. And I've since learned something else. In 2021, I filed a public records request with Caltrans and the Forest Service. I was looking for documentation on long-term trail angel activity near Castella. Volunteer permits, incident reports, anything tied to Maggie Frost. The response came back heavily redacted, but one unredacted line remained. A notation from 2003, flagged and reviewed again in 2017 and 2019. Unidentified continuation of aid activity at prior fatality site. Investigation deferred, no further explanation. The site near Castella is still there, the pullout hasn't changed, and hikers still report to finding fresh water there. No one ever sees who leaves it. The medical survey. In the summer of 2017, my life was routine, in the way federal fieldwork often is, defined by early flights, temporary housing, and the quiet confidence that most problems, once measured correctly, explain themselves. As a CDC field epidemiologist, I specialized in neurological and environmental clusters, the kind that don't make headlines because they resolve into charts and recommendations rather than arrests. I was accustomed to remote work, agricultural towns, river communities, forest service land, but Arkansas was supposed to be simple. A short deployment to confirm that a puzzling set of symptoms didn't represent an emerging exposure. 11 patients over 6 months, all campers or seasonal residents near the Ozark National Forest, all reporting headaches, memory gaps, and auditory disturbances. What made the case unusual wasn't the symptoms themselves, but the language used by the state health department when they escalated it. Several patients, interviewed independently, had described hearing the same thing. That phrasing alone was enough to justify federal involvement, and within a week I was assigned the case and sent south with a mobile lab and a narrow mandate. Find the cause or rule one out. The cluster centered around the Buffalo National River, A region that looks empty on a map but feels watched when you're there. Thick forest folding inward around narrow roads and campsites that appear suddenly and disappear just as fast. Cell service was inconsistent. Emergency access was limited. Hemmed-in Hollow, the site that kept appearing in patient interviews, was a steep, wooded drainage with a tall waterfall and a reputation among hikers for being quiet even during peak season. I arrived in July, set up a temporary base near the river, and began interviews. The patients were cooperative, but there was a shared hesitation in their answers, as if they were trying to describe something they no longer had full access to. Onset was sudden in every case. Decline varied. 5 of the 11 described the same sequence. A low-frequency hum they felt more than heard, followed by a voice. None claimed it spoke English. None could identify the language, but all 5 said they understood it clearly at the time. The message, they said, was about safety, about staying low, about being safer below. None of them knew each other. None had any reason to coordinate their stories. I ran the standard panels first. Water samples from campsites and streams, soil samples near fire rings and tent pads, air sampling for volatile compounds, heavy metals, pesticides, cyanotoxins, all within normal limits. No infectious agents, no industrial runoff. I expanded the scope to acoustic monitoring. Subsonic frequencies are poorly regulated and poorly understood, but there's literature linking them to neurological stress and hallucination-like experiences. I placed recorders around Hemmed-in Hollow and decided to camp there myself to correlate any data with lived exposure. The first night was uneventful. The second night, shortly after midnight, the forest changed. Insects stopped. The waterfall noise flattened into something uniform, almost mechanical. Then the pressure started. Not a sound exactly, but a vibration that settled in my chest and behind my eyes. My recorder logged sustained subsonic activity just below the range of conscious hearing. When the modulation appeared, structured, rhythmic, I remember thinking clinically that this would be the point where subjective bias contaminates data. Then I realized the recorder was capturing it too. The voice, if that's what it was, wasn't loud. It didn't compete with the environment. It rode on top of the vibration, shaping it. I couldn't have written down the words if asked, but I knew what it meant. The same message the patients had described, delivered with a certainty that bypassed language. I broke camp before dawn. By the time I reached the main road, my recorder had stopped functioning entirely. The files were intact when I reviewed them later, but the device itself never powered on again. When I reported my findings, the response from CDC headquarters was restrained to the point of dismissal. I was advised not to speculate and to frame the auditory component as a likely psychological response to subsonic exposure. Auditory pareidolia, pattern recognition imposed on noise. A secondary team was authorized, but my access to the site was limited pending their arrival. At the local level, resistance was more direct. A county official asked me to stop asking questions that scared tourists. A ranger hinted that people had complained about strange sounds for years, but said nothing had ever come of it. Requests for historical land use records were delayed or returned incomplete. It was clear that no one wanted to attach a federal neurological investigation to a national recreation area. The multidisciplinary team arrived in August and focused on geology. Beneath Hemmed-in Hollow, they identified an abandoned mining tunnel system, last used in the 1920s and largely collapsed. Water moving through the collapsed shafts created resonance chambers that explained the hum. It was a clean solution, and it moved quickly into the official report. What didn't move forward were the findings from the tunnel survey itself. During a safety sweep, team members found evidence of recent human activity underground: sleeping bags, food wrappers, improvised lighting, and a notebook. I saw it before it was logged. Inside were hand-drawn maps of the tunnels and a list of names with dates beside them. 11 names, the same 11 patients. None of them remembered entering the tunnels. None had any history of spelunking or mining. The notebook was removed from the site and never referenced again. When I pushed for its inclusion, I was told it was irrelevant and potentially harmful to patient recovery. My role in the investigation was terminated shortly after. I turned in my data and left Arkansas. A week later, someone accessed my field vehicle while it was parked outside my temporary housing. Nothing was taken. No report was filed. The area around Hemden Hollow was closed later that year for structural instability. The tunnels were sealed. Patients received cognitive therapy and medication. Most improved enough to return to baseline. The case was archived as an environmental exposure with no ongoing risk. 6 months after the closure, one patient didn't improve. David Pruitt continued to report the voice. He contacted me once asking if I believed there was something underground that needed help. Before I could respond, he disappeared. His car was found near the sealed entrance. No body was ever recovered. The disappearance was ruled voluntary. Officially, the investigation ended there. Unofficially, it didn't. I still have copies of the recordings. The hum is present. The modulation is present. Sometimes, late at night, when everything else is quiet, I think about how easily the explanation fit once the tunnels were found, and how quickly everything that didn't fit was removed. The ground beneath Hemden Hollow is still unstable. Water still moves through collapsed shafts, and whatever produced that voice understood us well enough to repeat itself. The family reunion. I had been with Child Protective Services for almost 11 years when the pool file landed on my desk. By then, my work had settled into a predictable rhythm. Intake reports in the morning, home visits in the afternoon, court documentation, compliance checks, and follow-ups that rarely led anywhere dramatic. Most cases resolved quietly, neglect addressed, services assigned, files closed. The job demanded emotional distance and procedural discipline. You learn to document everything and react to nothing. In the fall of 2016, I was working out of the LeGrand field office, covering a wide rural stretch of northeastern Oregon. Cases there were spread thin by geography. Families lived hours apart, often beyond cell service. Camping trips, hunting weekends, seasonal disappearances, those were normal. People didn't always check in. That context mattered when the initial report came in. The trigger was a call from extended family. Mark and Sandra Poole had not returned from a planned 5-day camping trip into the Wallowa-Whitman National Forest. They were experienced campers. 2 kids, ages 7 and 10. No prior CPS involvement, no domestic flags, no substance abuse history. On paper, there was nothing to suggest risk. But 12 days had passed. Phones went straight to voicemail. The family vehicle hadn't been seen. The sheriff's office initiated a welfare check and looped me in due to the presence of minors. My role was limited at first. Observe, document, ensure child safety if located. Still, I joined the coordination briefing. Search and rescue teams were already mobilized. Weather had been stable. No storms, no flash floods. No immediate environmental explanation. We located the pool vehicle at a remote trailhead near the edge of the Eagle Cap Wilderness. Locked. No forced entry. Food wrappers still inside. Car seats properly installed. It looked like a family planning to come back. We hiked in from there, 4 miles on a maintained trail before it narrowed into backcountry terrain. The campsite was intact. Tent standing, sleeping bags inside, cookware stacked, bear canister sealed and secured correctly. No trash scattered, no sign of panic, no sign of departure. The scene didn't suggest an emergency or a decision to relocate. It suggested interruption. The first irregularity was the absence of tracks. Soft ground should have held something. Footprints, drag marks, scuffing. There was nothing. Even wildlife sign was minimal. The forest felt unusually still. Not ominous in an obvious way, just muted. Sound didn't carry. Voices felt absorbed. By the second day of searching, we expanded the radius. That's when patterns started to emerge. Searchers independently reported hearing what they thought were voices, distant, indistinct, and inconsistent. Always ahead. Always fading when approached. Most assumed it was wind distortion or auditory fatigue. No one logged it formally at first. On the third morning, a volunteer searcher found the family, half a mile from the campsite in a natural clearing, all 4 sitting in a circle, hands linked, eyes open, no movement. They were alive, breathing shallow but steady, skin cold, pupils reactive. No response to verbal commands or physical touch, no visible injuries. It was a silent dread scene in the purest sense. 4 people present, conscious, and unreachable. EMS transported them out. Hospital evaluations showed dehydration and mild hypothermia. No toxins, no sedatives, no head trauma. Neurological imaging was unremarkable. EEGs normal. Doctors documented catatonia-like presentation without identifiable cause. Institutional resistance began quietly. Hospital administrators limited access. Sheriff's deputies discouraged detailed interviews. I was told to wait until they stabilized. Days passed. Media interest was deflected with vague statements. Forest Service representatives issued a brief release citing disorientation. On the 3rd day, Sandra Poole spoke. I was present for the recorded interview. She was calm, oriented. Her affect was flat but coherent. She described hearing singing. A child's voice. Somewhere in the trees. The children wanted to follow it. She and Mark went along to supervise. She described walking for hours without fatigue, hunger, or fear. The singing stayed ahead of them, never fully visible. She said they reached a clearing where the singing stopped. Children stood there, dozens of them, holding hands, all wearing clothing inconsistent with modern manufacture. Heavy fabric, buttons, boots, early 20th century. She said joining the circle felt inevitable. Safe. Time, she said, stopped behaving normally. The sun didn't move, the sky didn't change. They stood there without discomfort. Then the children stopped singing. One girl spoke, told them they didn't belong yet. To go home. Mark Poole's account matched Sandra's in every detail. So did both children's statements given separately. Language choices aligned, descriptions aligned, no inconsistencies. At that point, the sheriff's office closed the missing persons case as resolved. I pushed for environmental review due to child involvement. That request triggered resistance. Forest Service officials discouraged further searching, citing ecological sensitivity. That raised concerns. I filed a formal request for historical land use records. What came back weeks later changed the case. In 1917, a logging camp orphanage operated within that sector of forest. After a severe winter, supply routes failed. Records indicated abandonment. No recovery operation was ever documented. No formal burials recorded. A targeted excavation of the clearing uncovered human remains. Dozens. All children. Forensic dating confirmed early 20th century deaths from exposure, malnutrition, and neglect. The discovery triggered a federal response. The site was quietly secured. Excavation classified under historical recovery. No public memorial announced, no press conference. The Poole family was released from medical care. CPS closed involvement after follow-ups. But unresolved elements remained. Their youngest daughter began reporting hearing singing at night. Not hallucinations. She described it consistently. Always distant, always inviting, always asking her to come back. The site remains restricted under archaeological protection. No signage explains why. Officially, the case is closed. Unofficially, the clearing still exists, and whatever drew that family there has not been documented as gone. The wildlife. Observation. I've spent most of my career studying predators, wolves, cougars, occasionally bears. My work is data-driven, movement patterns, kill sites, territorial overlap. Long periods of isolation are normal. I'm used to sleeping alone in wilderness areas where there's no ambient noise beyond wind and animals moving through brush. It's a controlled solitude. Predictable. In early 2019, I was employed on a seasonal contract monitoring wolf behavior in the northern Rockies, primarily focused on human-predator interaction zones. Most of my time was spent reviewing GPS collar data and maintaining camera traps. Nothing dramatic. The work existed to prevent conflict, not investigate it. The trigger came in March when several outfitters operating near the Selway Bitterroot Wilderness contacted state wildlife authorities. Their reports were unusual but consistent. Wolves were not stalking livestock. They weren't aggressive. They were following people. Hikers, specifically. Staying visible, parallel movement. No approach, no retreat. I was assigned to conduct an observational survey and determine whether the behavior posed a risk. The Selway Bitterroot is one of the most remote wilderness areas in the continental United States. No roads, no permanent structures, no cell service. Once you're in, you're in. The trail network is minimal, and rescue response times are measured in days, not hours. I established a base camp near a known wolf corridor and deployed 12 trail cameras along game paths and sections of trail with recent foot traffic. The first week produced nothing outside normal parameters. Ungulates, black bears. 2 brief wolf sightings. Passing through, uninterested. On the 8th day, that changed. The wolves appeared on camera and stopped moving like predators. They weren't hunting, they weren't traveling. They were positioned near the trail, sitting or standing still for extended periods, facing the same direction. Watching. I initially assumed curiosity or habituation. Wolves will observe novelty, but the duration didn't make sense. Some of the footage showed them holding position for hours. On day 10, I reviewed footage from a camera placed along a ridgeline trail. At 3:47 p.m., a hiker entered the frame. Solo male, mid-30s, healthy, pack properly fitted, normal gait. He walked through the frame without stopping. 50 yards behind him, partially obscured by trees, were 4 wolves. They were walking in sync with him. Same pace. Same direction. Not closing distance, not lagging, tracking, but not stalking. I pulled footage from the next camera up the trail. Same hiker, same wolves, still following. At the 3rd camera, the hiker was gone. The wolves were still there, sitting directly on the trail, looking at the camera. That was the first moment I felt something shift. Wolves don't fixate on objects like that. They don't hold eye contact with inanimate devices unless provoked. I hiked out to the nearest ranger station the following morning and reported the footage. The rangers reviewed it with me. They checked permits. No one had signed in for that trail during the time frame shown. No missing person reports matched the description. One ranger suggested the timestamp might be off. Equipment error, they logged it as an anomaly. 2 days later, a body was discovered approximately 6 miles from the trail segment I'd filmed. Male, mid-30s, cause of death listed as exposure and dehydration. Estimated time of death, 5 days prior. That timeline put the man dead before he appeared on my camera. The rangers requested all of my footage. They reviewed it again, this time with state wildlife officials present. No one offered an explanation. The hiker in the video was moving. He adjusted his pack straps. He wiped his face. There was no indication of distress. Forensics were clear. The body showed decomposition consistent with being deceased for several days. An internal report classified the footage as unreliable due to environmental interference. I continued tracking the wolves for another week. Their behavior did not normalize. They abandoned known hunting grounds and remained near the trail and the recovery site. They frequently positioned themselves facing my cameras, close enough that their breath fogged the lenses at night. One evening, while reviewing live audio feed from the nearest camera, I experienced a silent interval that lasted nearly 20 minutes. No insects, no wind, no animal movement, just absence. When the sound returned, it returned abruptly. Before I pulled my equipment, I checked the final camera, the one closest to where the body was found. The footage from that night showed the wolves sitting in a tight circle around something outside the camera's field of view. The audio captured human sounds: crying, begging, a male voice. At 11:34 p.m., the crying stopped. The wolves stood up and walked away in single file. When rangers recovered the camera, they documented deep scratch marks across the lens housing. Not from animals. The gouges were parallel, deliberate, as if something had tried to get out. The hiker was identified as Ethan Rourke, reported missing 3 weeks earlier. His family was notified. The case was closed as an accidental death. The footage was classified, labeled corrupted, never released. I retained a copy. Officially, I was advised not to discuss the incident. Off the record, one ranger told me to let it go and stop asking questions about timelines that didn't align. I left the Selway Bitterroot early, terminated the survey, filed my final report with minimal conclusions. I still review the footage, the wolves, the hiker who shouldn't be walking. They weren't hunting him. They were staying close. And I don't think it was to keep him in. I think it was to keep something else away. The Firewatch Assignment. I used to think solitude was a skill you could learn. I'd grown up in small towns, worked seasonal jobs, spent long stretches alone without any trouble. By the time I volunteered for Firewatch duty, isolation felt familiar, even comforting. The work was simple. You woke early, checked weather instruments, scanned the horizon for smoke, logged what you saw, and radioed it in. You were part of a system, even if you were physically alone. I volunteered for 3 summers in Wyoming. The first 2 assignments were uneventful. Newer towers, clear procedures, regular check-ins. In 2015, I was assigned to a lookout in the Bridger-Teton National Forest that most people didn't want. It was older, built in the 1960s, minimally maintained. The stairs creaked. The windows didn't seal properly. The radio equipment had been patched and repatched over the years, but the view was unmatched. On a clear day, you could see 30 miles in every direction. That assignment came through as a routine placement email. No warnings, no special notes, just coordinates, access instructions, and a start date. I accepted without hesitation. It was my last planned season before moving on to a full-time job, and I wanted something memorable. The tower sat on a ridgeline accessed by a single dirt road that dead-ended at the base. From there, it was a steep climb on foot. Once you were up there, the world felt very far away. Radio contact was reliable, but cell service was non-existent. Nights were quiet in a way that made you aware of your own breathing. The first few weeks followed the usual rhythm: morning weather reports, afternoon scanning, evening radio check. I read books, cooked simple meals, wrote letters I never mailed. At night, I'd step out onto the catwalk and watch the forest darken. The first irregularity was small enough that I almost dismissed it. At 9:17 p.m. on my 12th night, I noticed a single point of light in the distance. Southeast, low on the horizon. It wasn't flickering like a campfire. It was steady, pale, and isolated. It stayed visible for exactly 4 minutes, then went out. I logged it as possible camper light and mentioned it during my radio check. The dispatcher acknowledged it and moved on. There were no reported camps in that sector, but unauthorized camping wasn't unheard of. 3 days later, at 9:17 p.m., the light appeared again. Same location, same duration. I checked my watch twice. 4 minutes, then nothing. By the third occurrence, I started paying closer attention. I used binoculars to fix the position relative to known landmarks. I marked bearings. I noted weather conditions. Nothing changed the pattern. Every 3 days, same time, 4 minutes. When I reported the repetition, the response shifted. The dispatcher suggested reflection from aircraft, then a distant tower, then a faulty perception caused by fatigue. I asked if there were any installations, research sites, or private land holdings in that area. I was told no. The area was designated wilderness. No roads, no trails, no structures. That answer didn't align with what I was seeing, so I started building my own record. I photographed the horizon at 9:15 p.m., and again at 9:20 p.m. I logged precise timestamps. I triangulated the coordinates as best I could from my position. The light originated from deep forest, roughly 12 miles away. What unsettled me wasn't just the regularity, it was the sense of response. On nights when clouds rolled in early, the light still appeared, muted but present. On nights when I delayed stepping onto the catwalk, it was already there, as if it didn't depend on being observed. On day 21, after reporting the phenomenon again and receiving no follow-up, I decided to hike out to the location during my off-duty hours. This was against protocol. Firewatch volunteers aren't supposed to leave their posts for extended periods, but I logged my departure time, left a note, and carried a radio. The hike took 6 hours through dense terrain. No trails, no signs of recent human passage. When I reached the coordinates, I found a clearing that didn't appear on any map I had. In the center was a canvas tent, military style, weathered but intact. The tent flaps were open. I called out. No response. Inside, there was a cot, neatly made, a lantern, a stack of notebooks wrapped in plastic, and an old ham radio connected to a car battery that had been recently replaced. The setup wasn't abandoned, it was maintained. I opened the top notebook. The entries were meticulous. Date, time, weather. One-sentence observation. Always the same time. August 14th, 1987, 9:17 p.m. Clear skies, the tower is still watching. Page after page followed that pattern. Years of entries. The language shifted slightly, but the focus remained fixed on the tower, on me, though I didn't realize that yet. The last entry was dated July 30th, 2015. The tower has a new watcher. She doesn't know yet. I took photographs of the notebooks and the equipment. I took one notebook with me. Then I left. The hike back felt longer. The forest was quiet in a way that made me acutely aware of every sound stopping when I did. When I radioed in what I'd found, the response was immediate, but controlled. I was told to return to the tower and remain there. Rangers would be dispatched. When they arrived the next day, they were professional, but guarded. They photographed everything again. They took the remaining notebooks and the radio. They asked me not to discuss it with anyone else. They identified the handwriting as belonging to Gerald Pitts, a former Firewatch volunteer assigned to a nearby tower in the late 1980s. Records showed he'd stopped reporting in after his tower was decommissioned. The assumption at the time was that he'd moved on. No missing person report had ever been filed. They found his remains a quarter-mile from the tent. The medical examiner later estimated time of death as late July 2015, likely natural causes. Heart failure. Case closed, according to the official statement. But there were details that didn't make it into that statement. The notebooks showed uninterrupted entries for nearly 3 decades. There were gaps in Forest Service records during that period. Missing assignment logs, incomplete decommissioning reports. Someone had known Pitts was there. Someone had allowed it. When I asked why the light continued to appear after the tent was cleared and the radio removed, no one answered directly. The ranger in charge said it was probably residual activity from other sources. He suggested I focus on my duties. The light appeared again that night. 9:17 p.m., 4 minutes. After that, things escalated quietly. My radio checks were cut short. My requests for clarification went unanswered. Once, I returned from a perimeter scan to find my logbook moved. Another time, I heard footsteps on the stairs at night, slow and deliberate, stopping just below the trapdoor. When I called out, there was no response. The most direct confrontation came a week later, when I was told my season would be ending early. No reason given. Transportation arranged without my input. I was instructed to pack immediately. I left without argument. A Forest Service vehicle met me at the base of the road. No one asked me to sign anything. No exit interview, just a reminder that internal matters shouldn't be discussed externally. Months later, I learned through a public records request that the area around the clearing had been quietly restricted. No announcement, no signage. The justification cited environmental rehabilitation. No charges were filed. No investigation was publicly acknowledged. Gerald Pitts' name appeared once in a supplemental report, then disappeared again. I didn't volunteer the next year. I didn't return to Firewatch duty at all. Sometimes I still check the time at 9:17 p.m. out of habit, out of something like caution. I think about the years Pitts spent logging that light, convinced the tower was watching him back. I think about how long he stayed after his assignment ended, and how no one stopped him. The official position is that the situation was resolved. An isolated individual, a misunderstanding, no ongoing risk. But the last photograph I took before I left the tower shows the light, faint but present, exactly where it had always been. And I know that whatever system allowed a man to live and die unnoticed in that forest hasn't been dismantled. It's just gone quiet again. The Trailhead Logbook. I've worked trail maintenance for the Appalachian Mountain Club for most of my adult life. 8 years by the fall of 2018. It's not a job people glamorize. You clear blowdowns, rebuild water bars, replace rotting signage, and haul tools farther than anyone thinks is reasonable. Most days, I'm alone from dawn until late afternoon, moving between shelters and junctions with a radio that rarely crackles. I like the predictability. Each season follows the same rhythm. Spring repairs, summer foot traffic, fall inspections before the snow sets in, winter shutdowns. The work is physical, but the system around it is orderly. Everything gets logged. Every shelter has a maintenance record. Every trail has a condition report. If something is wrong, it usually leaves a paper trail. In October of 2018, I was assigned to inspect a series of backcountry shelters along the Presidential Range. Late season work. Mostly checking roofs, inventorying emergency supplies, and collecting logbooks for archiving. Guyot Shelter was one of my stops. It sits high and exposed, far enough off the main ridgeline that casual hikers don't wander into it by accident. The logbooks are a tradition. Hikers sign in, leave notes, record weather, sometimes write messages to people who'll never read them. We collect them at the end of the season, scan them, and store the originals. Most are forgettable. When I opened the Guyot logbook that afternoon, I noticed the first irregularity almost immediately. The entries weren't chronological. Dates jumped backward. Names repeated. That happens sometimes when pages stick together, but this was different. The handwriting was consistent across entries that claimed to be from different people. I sat down on the shelter bench and started reading carefully. September 12, 2018. Beautiful day. Summit views incredible. M. Holloway. 2 pages later, September 14th. Cold night, heard something outside the shelter, didn't sleep. R. Vance. Same handwriting, same pressure, same slant. Then, September 18th. I don't think I'm alone. K. Stoller. I flipped back through the book. The pattern repeated. Different names, same hand. I assumed at first it was a prank. Someone copying names from older logs, but the tone didn't fit. The entries weren't theatrical, they were restrained. Observational, like real trail notes. Back at the base office, I checked the permit database. None of those names had active permits for September 2018. That happens occasionally with day hikers, but shelter stays are usually recorded. I flagged it to my supervisor. He told me to run the names anyway. Matthew Holloway came up first. He died in 2015. Fall on Mount Lafayette. Recovery report on file. Rachel Vance. 2016. Exposure during a sudden storm on Mount Washington. Karen Stoller. 2017. Fatal fall from the Franconia Ridge Trail. All three had one thing in common beyond their deaths. During their final hikes, they had signed logbooks. We keep archives. I pulled the scans. The handwriting matched, exactly. At that point, it stopped feeling like an anomaly and started feeling like a problem. I documented everything. Photographs, scans, page numbers. I forwarded the packet to AMC operations and recommended the logbook be pulled immediately. A response team came out within the week. They removed the logbook and replaced it with a blank one. Officially, it was classified as vandalism pending review. Unofficially, no one wanted to speculate. They interviewed hikers who had stayed at Guyot in September. Most reported nothing unusual. One hiker, Lisa Tran, hesitated before speaking. She asked if she could talk off the record. She told us she'd woken up during the night on September 19th and seen someone standing at the logbook, writing. She assumed it was another hiker, but when she focused, there was no one there. The logbook was open. The pen was moving across the page. She left before dawn and didn't report it because she thought she'd imagined it. The AMC closed Guyot Shelter for the rest of the season. The logbook was sent to a forensic handwriting analyst. The report came back clean but unsettling. The handwriting matched the deceased hikers with a high degree of certainty. The ink, paper wear, and impressions indicated the entries were recent. Written in 2018. No explanation was offered. The logbook was archived. Access restricted. I was instructed to stop discussing it outside internal channels. In the spring of 2019, I returned to Guyot as part of reopening inspections. The shelter had a new logbook. Standard issue, blank, except for one entry. October 15th, 2018. The day after I'd removed the original. Same handwriting. Thank you for noticing. We just wanted someone to know we're still here. M.R.K. I photographed it, reported it. The response was immediate and final. The entry was removed. The shelter remained open. The incident was reclassified as unresolved vandalism. After that, my assignments changed. I was moved off shelter inspections and onto lower elevation trail work. No explanation given. When I asked, I was told it was seasonal rotation, but I started noticing something else. Other logbooks, different shelters, different trails, entries that didn't belong. Same handwriting, same phrasing. We're still here. Always recent, always after I'd been in the area. I stopped opening logbooks unless required. I transferred out of shelter maintenance the following season. The AMC never issued a public statement. No law enforcement involvement. No closure notices beyond routine weather advisories. The archived logbook remains restricted. Guyot Shelter is still active. Hikers still sign in. Most never notice anything wrong. But sometimes late at night when I'm logging trail conditions at a different shelter, I'll flip a page and see a familiar hand, and I'll close the book without reading further. Because whatever was writing back then didn't stop when we noticed it. It just moved on to somewhere quieter. The Ecological Study. Before the summer of 2020, my work followed a stable, almost meditative routine. I was an ecologist focused on post-fire forest regeneration, the slow accounting of how landscapes recover after catastrophe. My days were spent measuring seedling density, cataloging species composition, logging soil moisture and nutrient profiles. It was solitary work, but predictable. Burn scars behave according to models. Recovery timelines are slow, measurable, and most importantly, explainable. I had worked the station fire footprint before, reviewing satellite data and historical plots, and nothing in the literature suggested surprises more than uneven regrowth or invasive species spread. When I received approval to conduct a 2-week solo field study in the Angeles National Forest, I treated it as routine continuation. Establish permanent plots, gather baseline data, and leave. The assignment was straightforward. I was to set up new vegetation plots in areas that had burned hottest during the 2009 fire, locations where recovery was expected to take decades. The trigger for the deployment was administrative rather than urgent, a grant requirement for updated field verification to match remote sensing data. I arrived in early summer, when the forest was quiet, access roads open but sparsely traveled. I established a base camp near an old service road and began hiking daily to predetermined coordinates. The landscape was still visibly scarred. Charred snags, ash-compacted soil, wide stretches of exposed ground with minimal regrowth. It was silent in the way burned forests often are, absent of birds and insects. Sound dampened by open space. By the 6th day, I was setting up a new plot in one of the most severely burned zones when I encountered the first irregularity. At the center of my plotted coordinates was a perfect circle of dense, healthy vegetation. Ferns, grasses, and wildflowers were growing in full, vibrant coverage. The contrast was immediate and stark. Everything beyond the circle's edge was dead or dormant. The circle measured exactly 12 feet in diameter. The boundary was clean, almost geometric. I documented it thoroughly. Photographs, GPS coordinates, soil samples from inside and outside the perimeter. Initial field tests showed nothing abnormal, No elevated moisture, no nutrient spike, no signs of irrigation or animal disturbance. Assuming anomaly rather than singularity, I expanded my search radius. Within a quarter mile, I located 4 additional circles, all identical in diameter, all hosting the same mix of species, all embedded in soil that should not have supported life for years. I logged the findings and contacted my faculty advisor by satellite phone. Her response was cautious but dismissive. She suggested fairy rings, a known fungal phenomenon, though she acknowledged the absence of mushrooms and the unusual species diversity. She advised continued documentation but warned against overinterpretation. The note was logged in our correspondence. I installed time-lapse cameras at 2 of the circles, positioning them to capture continuous overnight footage. For 3 nights, nothing changed. The plants remained static. Environmental readings stayed consistent. On the 4th night at 2:14 a.m., the footage recorded something the data could not contextualize. The air above the center of the circle appeared to distort, as if heat were rising from the ground. Then the vegetation began to move, not swaying, not responding to wind, but expanding. Growth occurred visibly, rapidly, as if time were compressed. By 2:31 a.m., the circle had doubled in diameter. At 3 a.m., the movement stopped. I reviewed the footage repeatedly. I sent stills and data logs to 2 colleagues. Both suggested digital artifacting or camera malfunction. One asked if the lens had been damaged by heat. I returned to the site the following morning. The expanded growth was physically present. Stems were thicker, root systems more established. The soil showed signs of recent displacement consistent with rapid expansion. This was my first hard evidence that something measurable was happening outside known ecological parameters. On the 10th day, I made a decision that in hindsight violated every safety protocol I teach. I chose to sleep inside one of the circles. The rationale was observational. If growth occurred at predictable times, proximity might reveal environmental triggers my instruments were missing. I placed my tent at the center and set up additional sensors around the perimeter: temperature, humidity, soil chemistry, electromagnetic readings. I initiated a continuous audio recorder and went to sleep shortly after midnight. I woke at 2:14 a.m. exactly. The forest was silent. No wind, no insects. The air felt dense, vibrating faintly, a sensation I noticed in my jaw and teeth before I could name it. I exited the tent. The plants around me emitted a faint glow, bioluminescent in a way that illuminated the ground without casting shadows. A low hum filled the space, uniform and sustained, not directional. I realized then that the circle had expanded while I was inside it. The perimeter was farther away than when I'd gone to sleep. For several minutes I stood still, aware that I was inside an active event without any means to influence it. This was the closest I came to panic, not because of fear, but because of containment. If the growth continued, there was no guarantee it would stop. At 3 a.m., the hum ceased, the glow faded. The forest returned to silence. When I checked my equipment, every sensor had failed simultaneously. Data was corrupted beyond recovery. The audio recorder was permanently disabled. I packed up at first light and left the site. I filed a comprehensive report, including footage, samples, and a detailed timeline. The response was swift and unified. My advisor suggested dehydration and sleep deprivation. A Forest Service liaison contacted me to say the area would be temporarily closed due to ecological sensitivity, and that further access was not permitted. My raw data was requested and archived. No follow-up study was authorized. 6 months later, independent satellite imagery confirmed what my field notes had recorded. The circles had multiplied. 23 were visible. Some exceeded 50 feet in diameter. All were located in high burn zones previously classified as non-viable for near-term recovery. The Forest Service issued a permanent closure. No explanation was provided. Requests for access were denied without appeal. I retained the soil samples I had collected. In controlled lab conditions, they contained fungal spores that did not match any known species. When cultured, they grew at a rate inconsistent with documented fungal behavior. Under specific conditions, they emitted light. Officially, the case is closed. The site remains restricted. No additional research is permitted. The circles are still expanding, according to the last public imagery. Whatever mechanism is driving that growth remains undocumented, unclassified, and unacknowledged. It is still there, operating on its own schedule, beyond oversight, beyond explanation, and beyond containment. The Lost Creek Incident. I've been a K-9 handler with a volunteer search and rescue unit in central Colorado for 9 years. The work is structured, repetitive, and methodical. We train weekly. We log every deployment. We document wind, temperature, soil moisture, scent age. Nothing about it is improvisational. When a search fails, there's usually a clear reason: weather, time delay, terrain. My partner, Pike, was a German Shepherd trained specifically for human scent discrimination. He didn't get distracted. He didn't false alert. Over the years, we'd located missing hikers, elderly dementia patients, avalanche victims buried under meters of snow. Pike had never refused a track. Not once. The call came in late September of 2019. A couple, Ben and Amy Cordero, had failed to return from a 3-day backpacking trip in the Lost Creek wilderness. Their vehicle was still at the trailhead. Their route was planned and shared with friends. By day 5, the county sheriff formally requested mutual aid, and our unit was activated. Lost Creek is deceptive terrain. It's not the highest or most dramatic wilderness area in Colorado, but it's isolated. Long stretches of dense timber, ravines that don't appear on standard maps, limited line of sight, radio dead zones. We deployed at first light. Pike was given a scent article from the couple's vehicle. The track came on strong immediately. He pulled forward with confidence, nose low, tail high. Classic indication of a viable trail. We moved along the main route for roughly 5 miles before Pike veered sharply off trail into heavy timber. No hesitation, no uncertainty. The terrain degraded quickly. Downed trees, narrow game paths, steep drop-offs. Pike remained locked in, ignoring wildlife scent, moving with urgency. Then, without warning, he stopped. He sat down, no circling, no reacquisition behavior. Just sat and stared forward. I checked him for injuries. None. His vitals were normal. I tried verbal commands, hand signals, gentle leash pressure. He refused to move. When I attempted to step forward, he pulled backward. Other teams arrived over the next hour. 3 additional K-9 units. Different breeds, different handlers. Every dog reacted the same way. They'd approach the same approximate point, then stop, sit, whine, pull away. None of them would cross that line. Command made the decision to continue on foot. Half a mile beyond the dog's refusal point, we located the couple's campsite. Tent intact. Sleeping bags laid out, food hung properly, boots still inside the vestibule. No signs of struggle, no blood, no forced movement. It was as if they'd stepped away and never returned. We expanded the search radius, grid sweeps, call-outs, aerial support requested. No response. No tracks leading away from camp. No scent trail Pike could reacquire once he was removed from the area. On the third day, a Forest Service helicopter spotted a flash of blue fabric near a ravine approximately a mile northwest of the campsite. Ground teams were dispatched immediately. We found Amy alive. Hypothermic, severely dehydrated, disoriented. She was sitting against a rock face, wrapped in her jacket, unable to stand. She kept repeating the same sentence. "He's still down there. He won't come up." Before evacuation, she grabbed my arm with more strength than I expected and told me not to go into the ravine. She said, "He's not Ben anymore." Medical staff documented her statements as delirium-related stress responses. We found Ben that afternoon. He was standing at the bottom of the ravine, knee-deep in the creek, not moving, not shivering, just standing there, staring upstream. We called to him repeatedly, no response. When we descended and approached, he finally turned. His eyes were open but vacant. No recognition, no fear. I identified myself. Told him we were there to help. He shook his head slowly and said he couldn't leave. That they needed him to stay. When asked who they were, he pointed upstream. There was nothing there. We guided him out physically. He didn't resist. He didn't assist. He followed instructions mechanically, like someone responding to commands without comprehension. Ben was transported for medical and psychiatric evaluation. Imaging showed no traumatic brain injury. Toxicology was clean. Doctors classified the episode as severe dissociation with no identifiable trigger. Amy recovered physically. In later interviews, she said they'd heard children laughing near the creek. She said the sound was close, then farther away, like it was moving. She said Ben went into the water to help someone who was drowning. She said he stayed there for 2 days, refusing to leave, talking to something she couldn't see. Forest Service officials discouraged further questioning. Incident reports were abbreviated. The area where the dogs refused to track was labeled environmentally challenging terrain in the final summary. No explanation was given for the canine behavior. Pike never returned to duty. After Lost Creek, he'd initiate tracks, then stop, sit, and stare into the forest. Training evaluations showed no physical or neurological issues. The unit veterinarian recommended retirement. I agreed. Ben remains in long-term care. He still talks about the children. Says they're waiting for him by the water. Lost Creek remains open to the public. Sometimes, late at night, I think I hear it too. Laughter, coming from somewhere I know better than to follow.